Scott, some news yesterday. The FDA has announced a pilot program to accelerate the early stages of clinical trials. And joining us right now to talk about the bigger importance of all of this is former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He is a CNBC contributor. He also serves on the boards of Illumina, Pfizer, and United Health. And Dr. Gottlieb, let's just talk about why this is important, particularly with the relationship with China and how we're competing.
Yeah, so what they did with these policies yesterday, so it's an aggregation of a number of different policies and different initiatives that they announced yesterday. And the goal is to try to make it easier to get clinical trials started here in the United States. So one of the big bottlenecks has been going into phase 1 trials, getting an investigational new drug application opened with FDA to get permission to start a phase 1 trial here in the United States to get proof of concept, to figure out whether or not a drug is hitting its intended target and suggest that it could have activity that could portend a therapeutic benefit. Because it's so hard to get those trials open here in the United States, a lot of biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies for that matter, but it's more the biotech industry, is moving their trials, their proof of concept trials overseas, particularly to China and Australia, because it's much easier to get these trials open there. So you can go there, get 10 or 15 patients enrolled in a clinical trial, figure out if a drug's working. If you get an indication of activity, then you raise more capital and go back to the United States to do the phase 2 and the phase 3 studies. So we're losing the phase 1 studies, particularly to China and Australia. What this policy does, and it's really an accumulation and aggregation of different policies, small reforms, but I think in totality are going to have a meaningful benefit if they get enacted. What it does is try to level the playing field to make it more efficient to get those trials open here in the United States. And so I think it's a very thoughtful policy. I think it was well constructed. And kudos to the FDA leadership team, the new FDA leadership team, for getting this out.
I think the bigger issue is what's happening at the FDA overall. You mentioned the new leadership team that is an interim leadership at this point, but you've got an article that was just out last week that says, make the FDA great again. What needs to happen for that, and how are they doing along those lines?
Well, the thrust of that article in the Journal of the American Medical Association was about having strong career leadership running the different medical product centers, the Center for Drugs, the Center for Biologics, the Center for Devices. That's certainly the configuration that the FDA has been run under for going back 30 years, and certainly the 25 years that I've been involved in the agency, and also under my leadership. I inherited a very strong leadership team from Rob Califf, the previous commissioner, and left them in place. They were a very good leadership team running those different centers. I think it's important to have political leadership over the organization, but it's important to have strong career leadership running those centers. That was not how the agency was being operated under the previous commissioner, Marty McCary. He put in political hires into those positions, people who, in my view, didn't really understand those jobs, and I think we saw the consequences of that. The current commissioner, Kyle Diamantis, has gone back to the old configuration, letting strong scientists run those different centers, and I think you're seeing the impact of that. Things have been much more efficient. They've been able to get out sound policy. You haven't heard a lot of controversies around individual drug reviews. They're going back and reevaluating some of the decisions that were made under the old leadership team to make sure good process was followed. And we've seen some recent headlines where some of those decisions are getting not just reversed, but re-examined. I think what they're doing is going back and looking as to whether or not good process was followed, and in cases where they weren't. And there was one case in particular where the new head of the drug center put out a very long memo detailing how good process wasn't followed in the evaluation of a diabetes drug by Sanofi. They're going back and re-adjudicating those decisions. And so you're seeing the agency, I think, get back to the footing that it's been on for the last really 30 years, which has operated pretty efficiently. And, Kyle also has been able to move out a lot of these policies that have been in the works for a while, particularly the policy we're talking about here today. And so I just think it shows that the agency works better when you have scientists leading these things and good, thoughtful, strong political leadership trying to push them forward.
Scott, I think part of the JAMA article, you mentioned that both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations in the past have tried to make this move of putting political appointees in, and it always backfires. Even if they think they're going to be able to be more effective and efficient, the industry watches this very closely, as do investors, to try and figure out how to best prepare for what is coming from the FDA. What's been the experience that you've seen?
Well, look, I think we haven't seen an effort to try to get so many political leaders into these scientific positions as we did in the last, year. I think that's been corrected now. But over the past year, when Marty was there, he put in place people who didn't really know these jobs. They were people that, had a certain policy orientation. They had cut their teeth being contrarians during the COVID pandemic. and they were recruited into the agency into senior advisor roles and elevated to run these different centers. And I think we saw the consequences of that. These are very difficult jobs inside the agency. There's a very steep learning curve. People who are put in the center leadership positions typically are people who are recruited from within the agency, because the work there is so particular. It takes a very long time to learn, the throes of how to operate inside the FDA. To give you an example, if we recruit a new medical reviewer who's very junior, who's never reviewed a drug application before, it'll be 3 to 5 years before they're handling a new drug application on their own. When they initially get there, they'll be handling IND applications and early stage files, and they'll be assisting on larger files, because it's a very steep learning curve inside the agency. At least a couple of years, often several years, sometimes as much as 5 years before you're handling complicated reviews. So it's very hard to go outside the agency and recruit people and put them in senior leadership positions over the scientific centers. And I will say, as someone who ran that agency, having very strong career leadership who are experienced, who are respected inside those centers, actually helps you get more policy done, not less. I think that there is a sort of knee-jerk view that what you want to have is political people that you can exert some control over and are like-minded, and that's going to allow you to get more policy out of the agency, and it's going to allow you to control decision-making within the science centers. Not that that's something that a commissioner should be doing anyway, but I think there's a view that it would facilitate that, and that's the exact opposite. What you really want is strong, experienced scientists in those centers that you have a good rapport with, that you can work with, that can get things done.
Okay. Dr. Gottlieb, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Up next, retail investors buying SpaceX in record numbers. Robinhood's chief brokerage officer joins us to talk about the IPO window and what clients are saying. Squawk Box will be right back.